And welcome back to the show. Hurricane Katrina was one of the most destructive disasters in American history, flooding New Orleans with a lot of people, thousands in fact, losing their lives, homes, and jobs. Now, there are thousands of stories being told about the New Orleans survivors, but the story of Mississippians ignored. Our next guest is releasing the obscured stories captured in her book, Overlooked Voices, Hurricane Katrina, Mississippi Black Women Survivors, Resilience and Recovery. Joining me now is author and disaster expert, Dr. Ophera Davis. And Dr. Davis, good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me here to talk about these women's stories. And you're exactly right. They're overlooked.
Yeah, and when we talk about like literally the flood, a lot of people did pay attention to Katrina. And admittedly, I could say that a lot of the attention went to New Orleans. But give us from your perspective how Mississippi was impacted.
Well, I will say this. Everybody probably focused on New Orleans because New Orleans is a big city and we've all gone there and we love that place. But Mississippi was overlooked because most people have never gone to Mississippi. And when they think of it, Mississippi, they don't have the, this sounds like a helicopter. It's going over my head. I am outside.
It's
So that's
okay.
what that was. It just left. So people don't know about Mississippi. They haven't traveled there. They don't know, when they think about the state, they think about the depressed state of the state. And so no one even realizes that Mississippi has an ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. Just like it is in Texas, it goes from Texas to Louisiana to Mississippi, all the way down to Florida. So no one knows that we even have a beach in Mississippi, and we do. So that's one of the reasons that it was overlooked, probably, when you think about the backdrop of New Orleans.
And when we talk about Mississippi, as things started to happen, we know that New Orleans got the announcement, hey, this is what's going on. We've got this devastating flood that's taking place, evacuation, trying to get rescue efforts in. How did Mississippi react during that time?
So what happened in Mississippi was quite different than New Orleans. So we saw what happened in New Orleans, but in Mississippi, we had a governor who was a Republican. And not only that, but he had great insights because he had been someone who had spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. So Mississippi, as far as the federal response, was really good in the state. And I write about that, and the women talk about the federal response in Mississippi here. But the thing that happened was the state was on its own for at least over 7 days to 10 days, because at first the response was a no response, just like it was in New Orleans. But after we got past the fact that Katrina actually happened and, there was a storm there, yes, since New Orleans is only 45 minutes from Mississippi, Mississippi started to do some things on its own. A lot of community workers in town started helping each other. This is something that the women talk about. So Mississippi, with the governor's contact, that helped a little bit in DC, but still, they didn't get the aid in Mississippi until 10 days after Katrina hit.
Wow, amazing. And I know that this really impacted you in such a way now that you decided, hey, I want to write about this. So give us a little bit about what was behind your writing and why you decided to write the book.
Okay, one of the reasons I decided to write the book is I'm originally from the state of Mississippi. I grew up in the Delta there, and I grew up in the Delta, but my dad and my mom would take my sisters and I down to the Mississippi Gulf Coast for vacations during the summer. And so I knew that New Orleans and Mississippi were close, that Mississippi was only 45 minutes from New Orleans. And I decided, as a trained researcher, that if something happened to New Orleans and there was a hurricane that was really bad there, which we saw on TV, then something had to happen to my beloved Mississippi Gulf Coast. And I wanted to be a part of telling the Mississippi story. So that's what even, initiated me to start the study back in 2005 when Katrina hit.
Yeah. And you paid an intense focus on Black women and how Black women actually survived and dealt with that. You chronicle stories and let people know a little bit more in depth. But for Black women, what was the impact like?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. the impact for Black women, as the impact is for Black women in all segments of life, is it was great. Some of these women lost their homes. Some of these women lost their jobs. Some of these women, well, we were fortunate. The women I interviewed, they did not lose any family members, but they knew friends who lost family members. So just as the impact for Black women is really hard in our society in general, we saw what it looked like in the other state. And here in Mississippi, Black women still had a hard time after Katrina, in spite of the fact that we had this governor who was connected, and in spite of the fact that the aid didn't come until 10 days later. Black women are resilient, and therefore they dealt with what they had to deal with. And that's what I allow the women to do in the book: tell their story, tell what their experience was like, and tell how they are resilient. So it's a great book to read.
Yeah, and when we talk about your book, it really chronicles about 10 years of life experience after Katrina, trying to find a job, trying to navigate, trying to make it through there. What was most compelling in what you were able to research and come up with?
Well, rather than give away the whole book, I'll give you just a little hint, your viewers a little hint. Actually, the women did lose their jobs, and many of them decided that they would go out, network amongst the people that they knew, because most of them had a college degree. That's one of the tips I'm giving you about the book right now. They had college degrees. So as a result of that, they went out and networked. They went out and decided, I'm going to get a job. One of them even said that to me. And so most of them, all of them actually, got new jobs. Some of them changed careers, became leaders in their community as far as employment is concerned. Other things they did, a lot of them, as I mentioned before, they had damage to their homes. Several of them lost their homes, and they talk about that in the book. Then they talk about what it was like to go through the process of trying to rebuild a new home in the midst of a disaster, kind of like what we've been dealing with the pandemic. We've been trying to figure out how to do life in the pandemic. And so a lot of them had to figure out how to do life again after Katrina, as far as getting new jobs, as far as getting their homes remodeled, or as far as buying new homes, or as far as trying to figure out how to navigate the time that they were dealing with. There was 100-degree temperature at the time in Mississippi right after Katrina. They were trying to figure out how to get food and water, kind of like what was happening with the pandemic. People are trying to figure out how to get food, jobs, and water right now. So the
Yeah.
experiences of the women is similar kind of to what is happening now, because it was a disaster, and the pandemic was its own disaster. So the book goes in depth, lets the women talk about their stories individually, one at a time, so everybody can hear what they said and how they became resilient and now have recovered.
What was your feeling like hearing that a lot of the focus really was on, New Orleans rather than Mississippi? Of course, being Mississippi bred, it had to leave a little bit of a distaste in your mouth.
Well, kind of like I mentioned before, New Orleans is a city we all love. Most of us have traveled there, enjoy going there, have a great time when we're there. So Mississippi has always been in the shadow, I'll say, of a place like New Orleans, since it's so close and only 45 minutes. But this is what I decided to do with that. One of the things I heard when I was a little girl is in Mississippi, a little girl in Mississippi, is this: if you're on top, New Orleans was broadcast a lot, there's always has to be someone who's holding you up. So guess what? I thought we're overlooked, but we're holding up the whole thing, because Mississippi took the brunt of the storm in Katrina. The entire infrastructure of the Mississippi Gulf Coast was destroyed as a result of Katrina. And as far as New Orleans is concerned, New Orleans was flooded, and there were some neighborhoods that were drastically destroyed. But Mississippi, imagine the entire section of one area of your region completely wiped out, completely, the entire infrastructure. There are no stores, there are no grocery stores, there's no place for people who lost their homes. Imagine, there are no businesses open, there's no McDonald's, there's no nothing. That's what it was like in Mississippi for at least 1 month after the disaster. So yes, they were overlooked, but they were still holding up the whole thing that happened with Katrina because they lost much, much more on the entire 120-mile area of Mississippi than just one city in New Orleans. But we all love New Orleans. I'm not going to be up on New Orleans. We love it, and
Yeah.
that's the story on us, being overlooked. I found a way to still tell the stories. Is what I decided to do about Mississippi Hurricane Katrina survivors.
Yeah, I mean, it's no shade. I mean, New Orleans is a major city, and everyone loves New Orleans. When you talk about the fact that we all do love New Orleans, but when you get down to it, you talk about a city versus a state, and a state that had a lot of challenges. And the problem that I raise now is we're in that season of hurricane again, where we're now in the midst of hurricane season. What can you tell us, because you're an expert on natural disasters? What can you tell us about possibly what we could be expecting right here our way?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. It's huge for us who are disaster scholars to talk about this. June was the hottest month in the history of the United States of America, the hottest month. So climate change is real. We're in the midst of hurricane season. We've only had one scare, Elsa. But you know what? Elsa was a wake-up call to us that we're in hurricane season. We are expecting, as disaster experts, we're expecting an overactive hurricane season this year. So one of the things your guests can do is find out their evacuation route from a hurricane. If anyone lives near a coastal area, you need to find your evacuation route right now while it's nice and sunny right now. Two, you need to pack a small disaster kit. It doesn't have to contain much, just water, a flashlight, batteries that work, and then a snack or two, something that's packaged so you won't have to warm it up, so you won't have to open it. These are some key things that people can do right now. One third thing I'll mention that people can do is they can find out if they live in a flood zone. That data is, if you go to my website, it's right there. I give you one link and you click that link and you put your zip code in, and it will allow you to figure out if you are in a flood zone. So you will know what to do. You'll know your flood zone risk, you'll know your evacuation route, and you'll have your hurricane kit packed. So you'll be ready to go in case we get a disaster. And we expect more disasters this season than we had last season. And actually, this is expected to be the most disastrous hurricane season we've had in the United States since 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit.
Amazing, amazing, and we hope that you're wrong, but we understand that the reality is very real, and we use a lot of that technology to find out what's going on, and we do know that that's actually predicted. So prayers and thoughts are really going out, and hopefully people can be well prepared in the issue of preparedness. What have you found? Have you found that most people, when it comes to that, are prepared? And particularly, give me a little bit about communities of color.
Mhm. Well, you know what? I'll go right to my book to give you some information from the Black women that I studied in Mississippi after Katrina. One thing I learned about those women that they told me in the interviews was because they lived on a coastal area, which is what I just mentioned, because they lived on a coastal area, most of them had evacuated for future, past storms. So they did have some type of plan, not as organized as it is today. Today, since Katrina, their plan is much more organized. But most of them had a disaster plan, so of some sort. And they have tweaked that plan and it's much better now. So that's one of the things I've learned about communities of color. We saw in New Orleans that, the disaster in news comes to, unfortunately, communities of color later than it does. Maybe that's the broadcast, maybe that's readership. I don't know what that's all attributed to, but what I know is we get the news a little bit later than other people might get it in our country. So one, we can be aware, like I just mentioned, you can know your flood zone. If you just know that, I've made it easy for you to know that. If you know your exact evacuation route, I've made it easy to do that. So these are some key things that can help people of color in particular get ready, because we will expect another hurricane. We actually expect 4 major hurricanes this season before November 30th. So What I learned from communities of color and these Mississippi Black Hurricane Katrina survivors was, one, have some sort of plan in place. It doesn't have to be, written out and you've talked to everybody, but do talk to somebody about it. And then the other thing I learned from them after that was, once they got some kind of plan going, and you will read this in the book, they talk about their plan and how they communicated with family and how they communicated with officials and how they learned different information and when they learned different information and how they used the information that they learned in Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina to make their evacuation happen for them, to keep them and their families safe. So there's plenty of data in chapter 3 that's all about Katrina's coming, the evacuation needs to take place, and the women talk about how they did it.
Yeah. When you have a disaster, there are different stages that people go through, and it can be devastating. And I want you to tell me a little bit about some of the stages that people experience, especially immediately after disaster.
Well, I'll go right back to the women in my study again, because that is what I did the most research on for the last 15 years. And that's this. I remember the first interviews I had with these women in 2005. In October, Katrina hit in August. I interviewed the women the first time in October. And I allow readers to read these narratives in the book. But I remember those were really difficult interviews. The women's voices, dropped a lot of times during the interviews. The women had to pause and they had to collect themselves, and then they went on with the interview. So the notion of what the stages of what happens in disasters is real. I did notice that these women were having a difficult time, immediately after the disaster. I will say that the next year when I interviewed them, because I interviewed each of them every year since Katrina, the next year, they were in a better place. They weren't completely resilient and have recovered yet, but their voice, they had figured out how to navigate the storm and use some chutzpah to kind of get themselves through it and make some decisions about, homes. They were still figuring out that piece. So the first year was what I noticed in the interviews. That was the most difficult year for the women. And so the stages of disasters are real. And then over time, maybe around year 5, I began to notice that, yeah, I hear their voices, they're different, their stories are different, they're moving, their vision is different for who they are and what they're going to do after Katrina. So as that happened, I noticed their resilience. And then as the stages of disaster goes, I noticed their recovery between 5 and 8, depending on the woman. And again, I allow them to give these narrations in the book. I saw the resilience and I saw the recovery. And that's what I want readers to see when they read this book.
Yeah. And I know you want them to see that, but also talk about the benefits. How do you think this will actually benefit somebody that actually picks up this book and reads it?
Well, you know what? One benefit was a benefit to me. And that's why I know it will benefit readers. Um, what I noticed was I got a lot of encouragement from reading these stories. I saw that regardless of what was happening in my life, I could help. I could do something about it. I could help people where I was. And I think readers will get that too.
Yeah. And from a perspective of a Black woman, how does your book really approach and change the narrative about Black women?
There are no studies on Black women in disasters in the United States of America. That means that this work is going to open the door for many women who want to start getting into this research, and it tells the stories of these Mississippi women in ways that have never been done. So I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to do it.
Dr. Davis, thank you for coming on, letting us know some real serious information when it comes to natural disasters, and definitely about the state of Mississippi and Black women and how they've recovered from the natural disasters. Got to take a quick break. We got more on social justice forums. Our conversation continues coming up after these breaks.